Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Once again, we have a very global audience in attendance for today's webinar. Thank you for joining. The webinar today is Fast Tracking Your Material Compliance Data Collection Program. My name is Mark Church. I serve as President of Sales and Operations for iPoint, and I will serve as a moderator and speaker for today's event. A few points before we get started. Each of our audience members today is in listen-only mode. At the end of the webinar, roughly 30-40 minutes after the presentation, we're going to go ahead and have roughly a 15-minute Q&A to take us to the end of the hour. In order to submit a question to today's speakers, please go to your GoToWebinar toolbar. There you will find an area called Questions, not chat, but questions, where you can post your questions to our speakers today. Please continue to send those questions in throughout today's presentation, and we'll go ahead and try to answer as many as we can during our Q&A session. I'm excited now to introduce our other speaker today, Scott Wilson, who serves as Content Solutions Strategist at IHS Markit. Scott has over 30 years of experience developing business information services to support critical engineering, compliance, and supply chain needs. He leads IHS's content services practice, specializing in developing content, tools, and processes to address product chemical compliance, such as REACH, ROS, conflict minerals, export compliance, supply chain issues such as obsolescence, constrained supply, and risk. Prior to joining IHS, Scott worked at technical positions at General Instruments, Tektronix, Advanced Test, and i2 Technologies. Hi, Scott. Thanks for joining.
Hi, Mark. Hello, everyone. Looking forward to a great discussion today.
Perfect. Let's go ahead and take a look at our agenda. So we're going to go ahead and just provide a couple minutes of background on each company so you've got some perspective as to where each of us are coming from today as we present our material. Scott will go ahead and just give us a little bit of a background and context in terms of where we are right now with material compliance programs. And then he's also going to talk a little bit about what makes the elements of a successful program. This is really critical because then we're going to really go in and focus on 6 specific areas that we feel can help you fast track your compliance program. And this will start with project setup and best practices there, efficiencies in loading bombs and performing the gap analysis, parts you have, parts you don't, data you have, data you don't. Leveraging information from outside or third-party reference databases, automating your data collection program, your communication with suppliers, leveraging third-party content services, and then automating a lot of the analysis, the roll-up, the reporting as well. We'll do a quick summary, and then we'll go ahead and I mentioned we'll move to question and answers. Next slide, please. So quickly, just a few notes about iPoint. For those of you who don't know much about the company, we're just over now 150 employees, over 45,000 individual companies using our applications to submit data, impacting now well over 100 million products in the system. And again, we're very focused as well. So while there's a lot of vendors out there, we're extremely focused on compliance and sustainability as it relates to your products. Next slide, please. Again, you can take a quick look here. We do have a very global footprint, so chances are we've got an office and a support team that can help you locally. Next slide. iPoint's applications and our entire vision is really around the product life cycle. So we start up in the right-hand side producing products and services for you, really designed at the beginning stages to make sure as your engineers are developing products that they're not only taking a look at the materials and the products that go into those in terms of compliance, but just as importantly allowing them to follow that next product through into its next stage production. So as paints, greases, lubes, et cetera, get added, those are critical for areas like life cycle assessments and areas such as REACH, packaging directives, et cetera. We want to continue to follow that through modules that track the product out in its use. So doing, again, LCAs, alternative assessments, some IoT. And ultimately, as that product now more and more comes back to you, back to your company, looking more again to focus continued on the reusability, recyclability, and recoverability of both the product and the materials in that product. Next slide. Scott, let me turn it over to you, a little overview on IHS.
Sounds great. Thanks, Mark. IHS Markit is really a new company that was formed by merging IHS and a company called Markit just over a year ago. We're now about a $3.4 billion company, and we're really a business information services company serving many diverse industries, from financial services to chemicals, automotive, aerospace, defense, technology, and many other areas. We have a lot of interconnected capabilities that give us really an extreme amount of power, and many of our offerings focus on actually tracking markets that our clients sell into. So helping them make decisions on characteristics of their products, helping them anticipate their competition and set appropriate sales goals on the on the demand side, and actually shape demand. On the supply side, we provide a lot of information on the products and materials that go into their products to help them understand obsolescence of components, of course, compliance, and many other areas, so they can have a very efficient supply chain. Next slide, please. One of the things that we'll be talking a lot about today is our reference databases. In particular, in the technology group, we support our electronics database. It's a database of over 500 million electronic parts, and all this information on these parts is maintained. So we have up-to-date compliance information, whether it's ROS or REACH or full material disclosure, as well as other technical information on those products. Next slide, please. There's several ways to access our reference databases. We have native tools to provide a catalog, a lookup, so part-by-part research and finding alternative parts for electronics of interest. We also have a BOM-based application, so our users can upload bills of materials, actually go through a part cleansing exercise and do very detailed obsolescence analysis and generate other sophisticated reports. When we move to more advanced material compliance use models or conflict mineral use models, we rely on our collaboration with iPoint to provide tools in that space. And Mark will be talking a lot about those tools and how those can help fast track your program. Finally, we round out our offerings with content services. We provide services to really address the gap parts that are not addressed by our reference database. Next slide, please. So first, a quick background on some of the regulations. This isn't a tutorial, but just a couple of notes on the differences between the regulations and some recent changes to the regulations. Probably the one that's been around the longest is ROHS. And of course, this is one where we track, and users need to track, the concentration levels of restricted chemicals, and they need to track them at the homogeneous material level. In the latest reincarnation of ROS, formerly known as ROS 2 or the ROS recast, it's now a CE marking regulation, which really directs us to go ahead and develop a declaration of conformity for each of the products that we manufacture, as well as to construct a technical file describing the due diligence, describing the compliance of each of the constituent parts and materials that we use in our bill of materials. So with these additional requirements, we're going to need a pretty sophisticated material compliance and management system. On the horizon, ROS is introducing an amendment that will include 4 phthalates. So products will need to be compliant with these regulations, so starting in July of 2019. This is an important date that many of our clients are working towards, especially in the medical device area, as when they make changes, when they identify the presence of these phthalates, their products have to undergo re-engineering and recertification processes. The second regulation around material compliance I'd like to touch on is REACH. This is a much broader regulation, so instead of addressing only electronic equipment, it really refers to all chemicals used in the EU, and from a product perspective, it instructs us to track the use of substances of very high concerns, or SVHCs. The concentrations are needed to be tracked at the product level rather than the homogeneous level. And this has been an area of controversy, with many companies and countries interpreting this in different ways. If you're a manufacturer of televisions, many companies had interpreted this as tracking the SVHC concentrations at the television level, but new interpretation and ruling from the EU has come out that you must track it at the individual component levels, or anything that can be considered an article in its own right. So instead of tracking a concentration levels at your TV level, you need to track it at the microprocessor, at the diode level, at your nuts, bolts, and screws level as well. So a major change really going to affect the use models that our clients provide. The last one I'll just touch on is California Prop 65. Although it's been around since 1986, we've just gotten an update on it, and companies will need to be compliant with the new regulations by August of 2018. This is much different than the other regulations. It actually covers almost 900 substances, and you need to determine whether any of these substances occur in your product, and if they do, whether if there's exposure to those chemicals, to those substances, and if there is, you may need to provide a warning on your product. So 3 different regulations treating hazardous materials totally different. If we can go to the next slide, please. So let's take a look at the elements of a compliance program. In a perfect world, we would have all the information, all the compliance information for each of the parts that we use in our bill of materials. So when we loaded this into a capable application, a capable material compliance system, it could use that information, interpret it with respect to the appropriate regulations, and then generate the overall compliance of that BOM or that product. But that's not the way the real world works. So let's go on to the next slide and see what this actually looks like. If we look at the leftmost side of the screen, oftentimes we'll be taking bills of materials from our PLM or our ERP systems. They'll be naked BOMs, if you will, so no compliance information associated with each of the parts. The first place that we'll look for compliance content is our internal compliance library. So if we've encountered this part before, chances are we collected that information. We'll be able to reuse that information with a capable compliance management system. If we've not encountered that part before, we can look to third-party content, such as the electronics database provided by IHS Markit. Hopefully, looking at that database of 500 million parts, we can find our part and pull off the appropriate content. This is ready-to-use content, and certainly a good example of fast-tracking our programs. If we can't get it there, we continue our gap analysis, and we'll determine that whatever's left or that gap, we can source using automated tools from our material compliance management system. And finally, of course, we can outsource all of that using additional content services. Once we have all that information, we'll need a way to interpret that information, quickly roll up that information to the product level, and generate technical files, generate an overall compliance flag, perhaps, to be passed back to our PLM system. Next slide, please. So when we consider places where we can fast track this, I'll expand this out a little bit and look at all the areas, including areas that we set up at the beginning of a project. Many of our clients are implementing material compliance systems after having done their compliance management in PLM systems or first generation material compliance management systems. So they have some existing content. So wherever possible, we're going to take that existing content and migrate it into the new system. Any supplier contact information, any of that master data management, we're also going to want to move over to our system. The other place for fast tracking is to make sure that we have an efficient and effective supplier communication plan. So we're going to want to spend some time up front to define exactly how we're going to collect information and how we're going to accept that information. And as part of that, we'll be reviewing the material compliance system that automates the sending out supplier surveys, receiving the responses, interpreting those, and either accepting or following up with the supplier on those things. Next slide, please. So let's go ahead and look in a little bit more detail at each one of these sections. So the first section on the next slide is the project setup phase. And when we look at this, we notice that we have oftentimes a lot of existing content to leverage. When we implement at companies with simple organizational structures, they might have one source to look for this information. When we're implementing at companies with multiple divisions or business units, we may have many different places to look. So the first thing that we'll want to do is to identify all these sources of existing compliance content. We'll want to assess the usefulness of this content. Oftentimes this was collected early on in early days and it's not complete, so we'll want to assess that. If it's good, capable content, we can migrate that in bulk and accept it as is into the new system. Or if we find that it's not perfect, we can review the part information on a part-by-part basis, determine whether it meets the acceptance criteria, and if so, accept it. Otherwise, put in the queue for following up directly with the supplier to get that information. On the master data management side of it, we're identifying contacts. Key is to make sure you leverage all those sources. You can spend a lot of time trying to find contact information at suppliers. If you've already established those in your company or some of those, let's definitely leverage those. We also find in our projects, as we have more and more regulations, that there's different contacts for different types of compliance information at the suppliers. So need to make sure you have a way to break that out, a material compliance management system that can support sending the conflict mineral request to conflict mineral suppliers and the raw screech request to the appropriate contacts at the supplier for that level of information. Next slide, please. A critical thing here during that setup phase is really establishing how you're going to engage your suppliers. Do you have existing relationships, or are these new relationships you'll need to form? For example, in the electronics industry, a lot of companies buy their electronic parts from distributors. So they have a relationship with a distributor, but oftentimes that distributor does not have the compliance information they need. So they have to engage the original component manufacturer, find the right contact information, and then educate them into their program. What information are they going to collect? Why it's important to collect that information, and for the supplier to provide that information in a timely way. Also to share with the supplier some of the tools that are available to train them to either understand the regulations or to better use the supplier portal as part of the material compliance system, what other types of support is available. We also bring them up to speed on what information we're asking for and the acceptance criteria for that information that we're requesting. We also let them know what will happen if we don't get complete information. So oftentimes, if it's not acceptable, we'll go back out to the supplier, work with them on corrective action plans to help them be able to provide the information that's needed. Critical to track supplier responsiveness, and that'll be part of our due diligence processes. Next slide, please. So one of the things Mark will be talking about is further empowering the suppliers with automated tools, so I'll leave that to him. And then really finish off with that. In addition to all this, we can also provide or you should consider content services. A lot of things, there's a lot of situations that can be very time consuming, such as suppliers that do not wish to use the supplier portal, so we can accept information via email and load it into the system. Some suppliers will provide PDFs in a variety of different formats. We can leverage that information and manually extract it and load it into the system. So those are areas to fast track your program. Let's go on to the next slide and look at leveraging information from the database. So the first step is really performing a gap analysis. When we do projects with clients, oftentimes they have an initial bulk load of information that they need to accomplish. So they're implementing a system for the first time or converting from an existing system. So they're trying to determine and collect information, detailed compliance content on all their parts. So quite often we do analysis on their behalf, as illustrated in the graphic results at the bottom of the screen. This is where we've done a matching analysis of their parts to parts in our electronics database. What we'll do is standardize the suppliers, then perform duplication analysis and report that duplication so we don't process the same part twice, making things so that, of course, makes things more efficient. Once we establish the parts that match, we do a second level of analysis to determine the coverage of compliance information. As we work with individual manufacturers, we find different manufacturers provide different levels of compliance information proactively, and so this is a reflection of that. In this case, you can see our analysis shows we had about a 46% coverage for full material disclosure for those parts. So great place to fast track. Next slide, please. So let's take a closer look at that reference database. Here's a view at some of the information that we have in our electronics database, so very detailed technical information, data sheets, life cycle information, and then, of course, very detailed environmental compliance information. We have certificates of compliance or declarations associated with REACH. We have full material disclosure as represented in the lower block, where we've broken down the part into its constituent homogeneous materials and subsequent substances, and provide the associated CAS numbers, weight, and concentration at the homogeneous level. And all this is, of course, leverageable by the material compliance system. Next slide, please. We have an integration between our system and the iPoint material compliance system. This is a dynamic integration. So after that part matching analysis, you can review the detailed part information for those matched parts, and then either accept that information or determine that you need to do additional sourcing or analysis on that. So this is actually in the iPoint system, reviewing those matches in detailed content. Next slide, please. So there's three different areas that you can think about leveraging content. One is that first initial build. This is when you have a bulk load, typically of thousands or even tens of thousands of parts, so it's a massive effort, oftentimes taking resources beyond the current resources our customers have. So certainly something you need to consider when planning your projects. Once you've deployed your system, your material compliance system, and you're using it on a day-to-day basis, you have to consider new part introduction. So as engineers need to go outside their preferred parts and select new parts, they'll need to collect compliance information on those parts. And then the final area is maintaining that information. There's various reasons for information to grow stale and out of date. The regulations can change, which would perhaps affect the compliance status of parts, so you'll need to check that. Exemptions, such as the Ross exemptions, have expiration dates, so that'll change the compliance of parts. You'll need to be aware of that. And of course, the parts themselves can change oftentimes, so to be compliant with the changes in the regulations. So you need to consider all these areas when you're thinking about collecting content information, all sources where we can fast track information using some of the topics we've discussed here. Next slide, please. So let me pass it over to Mark to talk about some of the tools with the iPoint system.
Thank you, Scott. Really quickly, before we jump into this slide here, just a quick reminder, go ahead and submit your questions. Thanks to those who have already submitted a good deal here. We appreciate that. We'll make sure to get those questions, as many answered as possible. Okay, so let's talk about some of the benefits of automating, especially the data collection component of your compliance program. So some of these are pretty straightforward, right? So the idea here, of course, is automation should reduce time and therefore reduce costs. So really eliminating a lot of the manual processes. I know a lot of you on the call here today are faced with, right? If we don't have certain criteria for business tools, then I know that that can often result in a lot of Excel spreadsheets or SharePoints. So there's a lot of manual processes that go on. That's clearly ability to fast track, but what that's doing is freeing up resources, and I guess that resource in this case is you. And the idea here, of course, is that's giving you more time to monitor changing customer requirements or other legal or other types of directives, more time to be spending with management, talking about the merits of the program, what you're doing, the improvements that could be made overall in your business processes as well. So giving you really more time to focus outside of those kind of tasks that could be truly automated. Also provides scalability. So obviously a lot of folks want to get in and start with one particular line of business or one particular unit. And of course, as you begin to really scale the program up, as others start to see your success, you're not going to be able to fast track anything if you're just simply taking inefficient processes and expanding those. You need to really build in that efficiency opportunity from the beginning. I think in terms of fast tracking too, it's really providing a consistent and a predictable process for the suppliers to follow. So, you know, if we're doing something different each time, if they're receiving different emails, different formats, etc., then clearly that's going to bog down the data flow and bog down the success of the program. So let's set up a business process. Let's run that machine efficiently and make it therefore predictable and scalable for suppliers. Naturally reducing human error, and of course, lastly, making auditing and easier, safer. So let's drill into this a little bit more. Next slide. As Scott mentioned here at iPoint, we do have a core application for this. It's called iPoint Compliance Agent, or IPCA. Looking over the attendee list, I'm happy to see a lot of the folks here who may already have the module. For those who don't, really what it is the ability to truly automate, the ability to collect, analyze, and report your data. And I want to really focus really in terms of fast tracking. I want to focus really on these 5 areas. One is a little bit of discussion on systems integration. How does that fast track your supplier program? Talk about the communications. This is really critical and very often an overlooked program component. We're going to talk about the actual submission from the supplier itself, your ability then to review that data and do that analysis, and ultimately at the end, of course, taking this data that you've painstakingly gone out and got and making sure that you're able to do the exports and the reporting as efficiently as possible. So let's just break these down real quickly in a couple slides. Next slide. When we talk about systems integration, we're really talking about 2 main elements that are on the slide: data flow into the application and fast tracking also data flow out of the application. So on the data flow in, obviously you've got a lot of information in ERP and PLM and other databases in terms of those supplier contact information, those purchase parts lists, your bills of materials, and of course any materials that you may have in databases that are going through to track and to approve new chemicals and materials as well. So it's a lot of data that can be leveraged or used from other systems. It may not always be in the same system, so we need to break that down. But clearly, we want to avoid a copy-paste, And as data changes in those primary records, we want to make sure that it's automatically being passed into your application, your system of record for compliance. And then, of course, on the back end, the data that flows out of the application. You're doing a lot of hard work here. So we want to take those parts that are red or green, those compliance flags. We want to pass those back to people, such as engineers, as she or he is designing applications. They want to be able to see those flags right inside of their CAD systems or other tools. Perhaps you've got a supplier grading system, and this is a wonderful element, a component of that grading system. So being able to pass that data into those systems. Obviously, management reports. The chances are your management is not going to log into this application. They don't have time. You may not have a license. So clearly, we want to get that data flow out into other systems where they can benchmark that against other metrics that they're using. And of course, the myriad of other statistics and data that are in the application. There's lots of methodologies for this, by the way, too. So there's not a one-size-fits-all. Clearly, it's dictated by volume. In order for something to save you time, it's got to be something that takes you a lot of time. So we take a look at what types of data could be potentially automated, and then we took a look at the methodology. Obviously, some methodology is easier and less expensive, and others is much more automated. Next slide. Let's talk about the next opportunity here, which is fast-tracking your supplier communication. I think this is a wonderful opportunity to really talk about how we can automate some of these emails, right? Because if you try to do everything in just chunks, so I do one batch in November, one batch in December, one batch in January, what you're doing is you're certainly setting stage gates, but you're not automating the process to a high degree. So the emails can be triggered upon activation of a new part or perhaps a new supplier in the system. So when that comes in from the third-party tool, manually or automated, it can automatically trigger an email. So you're taking 2 steps and reducing it down to 1. It can also be triggered based on a directive. If we post a new rule group to the application, for example, this can automatically trigger a gap analysis to determine where maybe a new substance exists, and then trigger that email communication so that, again, you're not doing a manual lookup process and then a manual email process. We typically want to set those reminders as well. So depending on your program metrics, you may say 15, 30, and 60-day cycles, maybe with escalation messages. Perhaps one of the additional ways is rather than having them have to search out and find maybe where to go to get their account in the submission and let's say the portal system, that can be triggered so they can be sent a key, if you will, automatically to let them go right in. And therefore, you're fast tracking their ability. They're not filling out first name, last name, company, etc. All of that information's been triggered for them. And that's going to help them as they decide how much burden this is placing on them to submit this data. And then again, here's a big area. So let's say you send the email to person A, and that person's not responsible for this task. So let's say then they forward that email to person B. Dear John, sorry, this is not my job, this is your job. When that second person comes in and completes the submission, your contact dates will be automatically updated with that information. And so that's really helpful, again, saving you a lot of time to focus on other areas and automating those processes. And of course, another big area is escalation. So you've got to work with other people in your company, people in contracts, legal, purchasing, engineering, and sales. So the ability to take some of those messages, those incoming delays, and trigger the automatic escalation processes, again, both internally and externally. Huge opportunity here, as you can see, to automate a lot of these procedures, saving a lot of time and really making the program more effective. Next slide. I also want to talk a little bit about the supplier submission. So how can we really help suppliers, right? So everything we just talked about, and a lot of that is helping you, but how can we also help those suppliers with their submissions? What can we do to make it easier, to fast track for them? Well, certainly I think one of the big areas is trying to cast the widest net possible for your data collection program. I think that this starts by saying we're not going to pigeonhole everyone into one source of data response. So this is a typical iPoint stance, which is we want to work with many different systems because we know that suppliers sometimes have data in other places. So we can even do something, for example, of monitoring a designated email box. So as they potentially put something into material compliance at abccompany.com, we can pick up that actual email. Some people just won't go to the portal. They already have an IPC 1752 or a COC document, and the best that you're going to get from them is an email. That's okay. We can automate picking up that email box and getting that forwarded into the system. Again, saving you more time. we can use tools that are out there like Sustain Hub, which is what bolts on to our IPCA solution. And this is where the suppliers go to make those submissions. And we're always happy to look and talk with you about integrating with other industry portals, such as IMDS or other industry standards, to help make sure that if the supplier has their data somewhere else, let's get that data. Let's make it as easy as possible for them if they don't want to have to make a resubmission. I think that the next bullet points are really critical as well. I think that ensure that your preferred portal allows the suppliers to build their submission, not just send the submission. What I mean by this is years ago, of course, most of us know that the standards such as IPC 1752, there really is no document. There really is no longer an updated PDF or Excel or other document that they can complete. So what you're doing is you're placing a huge burden on them to say, send me an XML file. You're going to be sending this email to a lot of people that just don't have the tools to do that. So the portal shouldn't just allow them to upload something. Sure, you could do that. That's a SharePoint. That's an email. That's not a solution. That's nothing more than a Dropbox. You really want to make sure that that supplier has a mechanism to actually build that submission. And ensure that the portal allows the supplier the option to reach down their own chain. If you're only saying to them, here, I'm giving you a tool, but you force them to go outside for another tool, you're really, again, giving them only half the solution. Something like Sustain Hub, for example, allows you not only to give that supplier the capabilities, but the suppliers below them and so on. So you're really providing a cascading tool and opportunity for them to continue to reach down the chain. When the supplier submits data, the portal really should check at the time of the submission for errors and then throw those red flags or those errors at that time. Obviously, what it's doing in terms of fast tracking is preventing you from having to do the review, find out there's a problem, send it back to the supplier. They're on vacation. Another 2 weeks goes by. This is not going to help. So what you want to do is right up at the very beginning, like I said before, we don't want just a place to drop a file. We want something that's going to allow to throw those red flags and help us make sure that at the time of submission, that a supplier can make an easy correction then. And then you may want to determine your automatic accept and reject criteria. I'm going to talk about this a little bit more later, automatic accept and reject criteria. So I'm going to skip here, next slide, but we're going to talk about this a little bit more. Go ahead,
Great,
Scott, back to you.
Yeah, thanks. So just a couple of quick notes. One of the things that you can always do, even using these automated tools, is to outsource this process to a third party. One of the things that we see is, again, at the beginning of the process, just a massive amount of data on oftentimes tens of thousands of parts really is overwhelming for the existing staff. Most of the people who are given this responsibility to go out and collect this information are normally component engineers or design engineers who would much rather be doing their core tasks. So certainly consider outsourcing this to a third party, especially for that critical initial phase where it can be done quite quickly and cost effectively. Let's go to the next slide. A typical sourcing project really looks something like this. We provide the initial introductory letter to the supplier, confirming contact information, adjusting it if necessary, following up with that with an initial survey so they already understand what the project's all about before they get that initial survey and understand the importance of it. Many suppliers will respond at that first request, but some suppliers certainly need a follow-up reminder, as we know they have many tasks on their plate. So oftentimes after we send the reminders and remind them that we also can provide them with assistance, whether this is assistance with the regulations or assistance using the tools, they'll respond to very well to that. In other cases, some suppliers won't immediately respond. Some suppliers require proof of purchase. They don't recognize the company requesting the information, so they need further information. Oftentimes, there's an escalation process that goes on to obtain this information internally and provide it to the supplier so they can complete the task of providing that content. Next slide, please. So some of the things just to consider when you are considering outsourcing is, you want to make sure you select a company that understands the various regulations. They're familiar and have been working with suppliers obtaining this information. Really take the mantra of trying to make it easier for the supplier to provide information rather than just providing them with a burden. Oftentimes that includes using the right mix of tools and technology to help suppliers provide that information. Next slide, please. Mark?
Okay, perfect. Thanks, Scott. Let's go ahead and talk a little bit now about some ability to do some fast tracking of your analysis and reporting. So as we mentioned earlier, it's great to work with the software provider to automate updates and changes to regulations. So having a team that's already looking at the REACH and the ROS and the Prop 65 and all the other directives out there, obviously being able to automate the process of having those updates done is really critical. That way you're not going back essentially and having to do all that research, but depending on a collection of team subject matter experts to make sure that those directives are updated. I think that, you want to try to avoid manual data analysis wherever possible, right? So if you're getting a high volume of parts, trying to do this lookup and the weights and the calculations and the exemptions and how those exemptions roll up can be really painstaking. So clearly volume is quickly going to help you and dictate that there's going to be a lot of time in fast tracking the analysis by automating a lot of those procedures. And then I think that, as we mentioned a few slides ago, really maybe take a look at automating your incoming responses. Depending on your company's risk tolerance, you can set a very high or low rejection criteria. If you want to basically say if this particular part meets these certain criteria for weight, exemptions, etc., then you can have a predefined acceptance criteria, and therefore it's automatically being accepted when that data comes in. Or on the flip side, automated rejection criteria. And not only are you going to reject that submission, this is very important, but you're going to include the rejection reasons. And just like we said before, even if the supplier gets through the front end of the portal and there is a need or a reason to reject that submission, don't just say, sorry, please go resubmit. You can automate the process of saying, you are missing A, B, C, or D. Here's how you fix that. Please go back and fix and resubmit. And therefore, again, you're automating a lot of this communication and the speed of that communication to really be able to fast track that analysis of that data when it comes in, so you're not manually painstakingly going through a lot of those details. Next slide. And I think lastly, we're going to talk just briefly here, one slide about fast tracking your reporting opportunities. So obviously a system like this allows you to centralize your data in your system of record. So clearly providing one location and easy access for raw data. You automatically want to typically generate reports. You can quickly generate a REACH or a ROS or other type of report out of the system. You may get a lot of requests from customers, and therefore you want to generate quickly a certificate of compliance out of the system. Putting in your chief CEO or CFO or whoever it may be's signature and being able to quickly get a sign-off on a document. Again, we talked earlier about management dashboards and being able to automate that reporting back into the stakeholders who really should see and do require that information. We also talked again on the reporting side of being able to send those compliance flags back to other systems like CAD or PLM systems, for example. I think that it's really critical to also note that when it comes to reporting, you want to be able to automatically track all of that supplier communication, all of that due diligence. It's really important. You want to be able to hold that supplier. A lot of you have contract terms that says a supplier will have a penalty if they don't respond in 30 days or 90 days, et cetera. You're putting teeth into your program. But if you can't go back and say, oh, when did I email? What was the actual date? And when did they resubmit the data? If you can't accurately get that data out quickly, you can't leverage the teeth that you already have in those contracts. So being able to see this information and pull it out very quickly is often very critical. And I think that automatically, this is going to take you from point-in-time compliance to a continuous improvement process. And that continuous improvement, that alone is going to really help you fast track instead of doing spot treatments each time this request comes in. Okay, next slide, please. Great, Scott, I'll turn it back to you. Scott, you might be on mute.
Thank you. So we see many places that we can fast track including leveraging existing content in our enterprise systems, to leveraging content from third-party providers such as IHS, using automated systems for requesting surveys and getting responses and evaluating those and accepting, rejecting, or following up, outsourcing services to run the project, and of course system of reference with all the appropriate automation tools to generate reports and provide flags back to our enterprise systems. So let's go to the next slide, and we'll have a poll question come up. And really what we'd like to ask, and this is a private poll, so other people won't see your responses here, but what we're offering is a no-charge analysis. If you provide us your parts list, we'll actually match this against our electronics database and provide you coverage analysis with respect to full material disclosure information, ROS and REACH information. So really give you a sense of how you can use the IHS database, electronics database, to fast track your program. So click on yes if that's of interest. If it's not, that's fine. Of course, just click on no. If you do click on yes, we'll follow up with you to obtain that information and provide you with the report.
Nice work, Scott. Okay, great. Hey, everyone, appreciate you sticking around for the Q&A. We're going to take a few questions, but we're going to go ahead and keep this brief. We want to get you out of here on time, making sure that everyone has a little bit of time to transition to their next meeting. So real quickly, just some house cleaning here. Lots of questions coming in about receiving copies of the presentation. We are recording today's event, so we will make sure that each of you does get a link to that recording. So if you want to review any content in specific or share this with colleagues. We do get quite a few questions in here as well about what systems we integrate with. I think that that's great. So people are already thinking about what other systems. We've got some folks asking about SAP. We've got a few folks asking about JD Edwards. So we'll follow up with you individually, but we have integrated typically with every major PLM ERP system. So the blanket answer is yes, but obviously there's a chance to take a look at those individual systems. A few questions. For example, Leslie and a few others are asking about linking with other portals, for example, BombCheck. Absolutely. So a lot of those systems have an XML export to get the data out. That's pretty standard. You shouldn't be held hostage for that data that you've used with that third-party system. So we can typically leverage that data out often in an XML IPC 1752 or standard data. So just wanted to take care of a few questions along those lines. I'm going to go to a couple quick questions here. I like Don's question because I think it maybe is a clarification point. He was asking, and maybe this is Scott, I think for you in terms of a clarification. He says, are you recommending bypassing the distributor and going straight to the manufacturer of the product? I know you deal with this every day with dealing with these distributors. So maybe the opportunity to clarify maybe what you think your approach is with distributors here.
Right. So we recommend only going as far as you have to get the information that you require. So the short answer is that if a supplier can provide you information, that's wonderful. Definitely go for that. One of the things that we've seen is different types of suppliers can provide that information and others can't. In the area of electronics, we find that it's often necessary to go to the original component manufacturer to get that detailed material compliance information that we require. So in those cases, I would go directly to the original component manufacturer. Other suppliers oftentimes can get that information on their own and are sometimes unwilling to provide you additional information on specific manufacturers and manufacturer part numbers. So just go as far as you can, but understanding and having some experience in this area certainly helps us fast track knowing what we can expect to get from different types of distributors and suppliers.
Thanks. This is a pretty common question, and I think after all the great things we talked about fast tracking, this is a pretty natural response to that. Alan's asking, okay, so what do you do with non-responsive suppliers? Scott, maybe I'll let you take that one as well.
Yeah, this is a part of the reality of each of our projects. We have some non-responsive suppliers. They're non-responsive because of different reasons. Some of them are non-responsive because they're actually out of business. So we deal with a lot of parts lists that have been maintained for years and years and years, and some of these things are outdated. So we definitely run into those. We also find that it's often useful when it's clear that we're not going to get a response from the manufacturer to escalate it with our clients through oftentimes their various commodity groups with the direct relationships with them. And oftentimes they can get involved and basically share with them more of the details of the projects and oftentimes compel them to provide the necessary information. So that's typically what we like to do and what we like to see. We also are a big advocate of closing the loop, meaning that as you engage in new contracts, that providing this type of information is one of the requirements of the relationship. So again, setting expectations correctly when you're first negotiating or renegotiating terms with suppliers. So those are some ideas.
That's great. That's really good. And I would just say that to add on to that is you're really talking always about a funneling or a distilling process. Obviously, as you get, let's say, 100%, that would be amazing. But we have clients that spend quite a bit of money and never get to that level, right? So you're really looking at, again, measuring risk tolerance. If you get down to 80%, 90%, what have you, what are you doing with that last little bit? And that's where you need to funnel down. You start to get into your risk tolerance. If you can take a look at a drawing and or a spec and say, oh my goodness, this is a 1010 steel. I didn't hear from this small supplier. Well, I don't feel comfortable making a submission on their behalf. I feel very comfortable with my risk tolerance level that this is meeting the specs that I need, and therefore I'm going to, internally mark it, but not necessarily from an audit purpose say that I got it from the supplier. Of course, there's opportunities to do things like testing as well. Testing gets very expensive. So as you get down to those final elements, you may be looking at your risk tolerance and saying, I'm down to 10 or 15 parts, but there's only one or two of those parts that I'm really that concerned about based on what I think is the makeup. And therefore, maybe I'll just test the one or two because the other ones I'm confident it may be a very common plastic or a metal or a wood or whatever it may be. So in those particular cases, we really need to look down and see what we're missing and then maybe do a distilling process down to how to finalize that gap. Well, again, lots of questions coming in, so I think we're going to have to take some of these offline. Leslie's asking, can you facilitate getting other information, for example, country of origin? And the answer there is yes. So I think it's important to note, and Scott mentioned this earlier, that if you look, say, for example, for those of you that are in unique industries like medical device, material compliance and REACH says nothing about things like latex or animal derivatives or other areas. So these applications and the services teams are able to go out and get what I would consider non-common data. Country of origin may be used for things like NAFTA, for example, if you want to gather the same material process to pick up a couple of points of data along the way to help you with your NAFTA reporting, for example. So the answer there is yes, that can be typically done as a additional wizard, an additional question that they ask as they go through the submission process. We'll take one last one here, Scott, and then I think we'll go ahead and close. I think that this next question was related to your survey, I believe, or your poll question. And it says, what would be really needed what kind of part cleansing is needed to use the IHS database? I guess the idea there is what are folks going to have to do to get kind of poised on their end to know where to take a look at these gaps?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's a good question. There's two fundamental ways to do that. Certainly, if you're a client that's using our bomb intelligence product, there's tools that actually help with the data cleansing process. So when you provide a manufacturer the way that you represent it in your system and provide a manufacturer part number, we have some auto cleansing tools that can automatically match some parts, and other parts it'll help you match with some some close matches and the reason for those close matches. So certainly using those tools are a great help in going through that cleansing process. The other thing that we do with material compliance projects is that we often do that matching analysis, that cleansing on the front end of our projects as part of the project. So we'll actually use some internal tools that we have to go through that analysis, that cleansing process, doing the match, and then reporting those results back to our clients.
Thanks, Scott. Okay, as promised, we're going to get everyone on here a few minutes earlier. So thank you, Scott, again for a very informative presentation, and thanks to each of you in the audience for joining and participating in the webinar and the Q&A today. As I mentioned before, we've recorded today's webinar, so if you missed any portion or want to share it with a colleague, you will receive a follow-up email with a link to the recording. Scott, any closing words from you?
No, just want to say thank you for everybody from attending. Be looking forward to hearing from you for that analysis if that's of interest, and good luck with your material compliance projects.
Thanks, Scott. And again, thanks everyone. We hope you have a great day. We're going to go ahead and end the presentation here. Thanks again. Take care.